Some leaders leave footprints, others leave libraries. You're tuning into the Authors on Mission podcast, where industry giants become literacy legends. In every episode, we talk with authors who turn their brilliance into books that transform lives. I'm Danielle Hutchinson, your host and Chief Creative Officer at Authors on Mission. Welcome to your authorship experience. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Hutchinson, Chief Creative Officer here at Authors on Mission, and today we're going to be chatting with a guest who literally went from rocket science to revolutionizing how we think about workplace fairness. Meet Paolo Gaudiano, a man who jokes about mastering rocket science and brain surgery. He decided after that to tackle something very difficult, creating companies where people thrive, where profits soar. Armed with degrees in applied mathematics, aerospace engineering, and computational neuroscience, Paolo has done many people thought was impossible. He turned inclusion from a feel-good initiative into precise, measurable science. His book, Measuring Inclusion, Higher Profits and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash, isn't just another business book. It's a shift wrapped in data and delivered with the precision of a former professor who's cracked the code on human potential in organizations. So get ready, because we're about to explore how mathematical precision meets human potential and why the most successful companies of tomorrow will be the ones that crack inclusion today. So without further ado, Paolo, welcome to the show.
Danielle, thank you so much. And by the way, with an introduction like that, I feel like we could just end the conversation right now, and that would be awesome already. Great job. That's one of the best introductions I've heard. So thank you very much. Really appreciate being here.
I appreciate it. I always like to do a little research and get to know my authors before they come on the show. And I think your story is, very inspiring, and that, we can all learn a lot from your journey here and everything that you've put in the book. So definitely. Well, that being said, I think, I did give that introduction, but of course there are some gaps to be filled there. So I'm wondering if you could shine a little light on this. I mean, you had an extraordinary career in rocket science and brain surgery, but then in 2015, you realized you can do something a little bit different and apply this to workplace inclusion. So what was this moment that triggered that shift? Was there a certain events that happened, or was it gradual in the decision-making process? How'd that all come to be?
So first of all, I always like to start my presentations or my podcast by jokingly referring to myself as the white elephant in the room. It's like, what am I doing working in DI? And that ties to your question, which is that I had been personally interested in DI for a long time. I came to this country as a teenager. I recognized early on that there were some very strange things, especially when it came to racial tensions in the United States, but also I learned about some of the inequities with gender, etc. But I always felt like, what can I do? I'm a white guy, I'm not an activist. And so I kind of went on following some news and information, and occasionally would go to conferences and sit in on the sessions about DI, etc. But meanwhile, my career evolved, as I pointed out, as you mentioned, degrees in applied mathematics, engineering, fell in love with how the brain works, had an opportunity to study aerospace engineering and neuroscience at the same time, and then did a PhD in computational neuroscience. And all of the sort of the common thread to all of these things that I worked on was the idea of understanding how an individual element connects to the broader system that they're a part of. So this could be initially studying how neurons can collectively do things like enable us to see and speak and move and things of that sort. And then later, both outside of academia and in some of the research that I've been doing, I started to understand how individual people can, let's say, contribute to an organization, or maybe drivers on a highway or soldiers on a battlefield. And one day, so this kind of all converged at a very specific time. 10 years ago, I was attending one of these many sessions on DI, how do you get more women into leadership roles? How do you get more people of color into certain fields? And as I sat there, listening to the very poignant, very detailed stories that people told of things that happened to them because of their race, because of their gender, because of their sexual orientation, I was struck by, when it came to solutions, we were talking about really vague things, like we need to remove structural racism, we need to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. And as I sat there contemplating, how do you close that gap between the individual stories and the collective experiences, I thought, well, this is what I've been doing for literally, at that point, I've been doing it for more than 20 years. And I thought, can I take all of the methodologies, which really rely a lot on building these computer simulations and kind of understanding human behavior, and then letting the computer simulations give you kind of a mathematical or a quantitative answer, I thought maybe I can apply it to the space. And my goal was, if I can only find a way of quantifying the benefit that companies will have by treating their employees better, I can come up with a winning argument, because ultimately telling people that companies that are more diverse on average tend to perform better is really not very useful. It's only correlation, and there's many reasons why that kind of information is not really actionable for a CEO. But if I can go to them and say, here's what's happening in your company, and here's how it's costing you money, then that could really be a game changer. And that's exactly what I ended up doing. I spent about a year doing my own research, realized I was onto something very, very exciting. I started in short succession between 2018 and 2019. I started Alaria, which is a company. It's a for-profit startup that focuses on measuring inclusion for corporations. I started ARC, which is a 501c3 where I do more core research using the same methodologies about DEI in general. And I also had started a research activity at the City College of New York with my dear friend and former colleague, Gilda Berabino. We started a small research center and launched a conference on diversity and inclusion research.
Well, wow, that is really quite the journey, and a really impressive one too. And I mean, even more so, you've won awards based on all of this. You received a Moonshot House Fellowship, and for example, for all the work in this. So it must feel really great to have that recognition and to know that your approach is working to solve problems.
That's absolutely right. And the fact is, I don't always, it's not that I pursue these. I mean, it's actually sometimes I do. You have to, for a lot of these kinds of awards, you have to apply for them. I've had the fortune, partly because of my interdisciplinary background, partly just because I've been a very curious person. I've always liked to do a million things, from when I was a little kid. I love feeling that I've gotten to a level of quality in a field where I'm actually making an impact, but I'm very fortunate that I've always been able to do that in fields that I absolutely adore. So when I was studying neuroscience, I was able to get a Sloan Fellowship in neuroscience. At the time, I was studying how the retina works, how our eyes can do this incredible thing of taking light. And our eyes work much better than cameras, but we don't really understand how that happens. And so part of my PhD was on studying how the retina works, and I was able to apply that to machine vision and other things, and I got that fellowship in neuroscience. I also learned how infants, not just of people but of animals, learn to control their movements on their own, and used what we learned about how the brain solves that problem to learn to control mobile robots. And so I also got a robotics fellowship from the office of what's called the Young Investigator Award from the Office of Naval Research. And then later, when I became a social entrepreneur, I was able to get that, as you mentioned, that Moonshot House Fellowship from the Kravis Center for Social Impact at Claremont McKenna College in California. And what was very interesting is that at the time I was in my 50s already. I'm now 63 years old, and I joke with people that it took me 53 years of my life to figure out what I want to do when I grow up. And when I won that fellowship, as part of the fellowship, I had the fortune of going for about 10 days to Thailand, where we had essentially a retreat where we were taught about social entrepreneurship. And it was the first time that I felt like I was in my community, like I'd found a community. I'd found a space where I was finally able to bring together a personal passion with my professional capabilities, and I was able to leverage my background in teaching, in academia, in research, in corporate consulting, entrepreneurship, and bringing it all together into something that actually makes a difference in society. And I have to tell you, I feel so fortunate that I've been able to do that, even though it's taken me a few decades to get here. I feel like I'm now making up for that by blasting away and doing some work that right now is particularly important.
Yeah, and hey, it really is important stuff, because you really have influenced so much, but it's like I mentioned before, you've worked hard at it and you've succeeded, and that's just what's wonderful about it. And now it's all in the book also, which allows anybody to pick it up and learn a little bit about it, which is, just wonderful. So kind of transitioning into the book a little bit, I see you have the cover right there on the background. So for everybody interested, that's exactly what it looks like. You can take a look for that beautiful rainbow graphic when you're searching for it. I'm wondering, did you have any say in the cover design? Because that is a really nice logo.
Thanks. Actually, I did. So I kind of went back and forth about the title, subtitle, and I really wanted to convey the fact that this was not just another book about DEI in the traditional sense. And so the idea is that you're kind of seeing a growing bar chart. It's supposed to give the idea that there's growth and expansion, and then underneath that there is people. And the idea is that you can fuel the growth of an organization by effectively managing your talent in a smart way. And so the design, actually, I came up with the idea of doing the growing chart and some people behind it. And my version was like these very ugly, very rectangular bars with little icons underneath. And then I had a great designer. My publisher actually works with the design team, and they came up with a few designs. And this one I really loved. It's interesting because when I wrote the book, I could see some of the problems that were happening in the world with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I talk specifically in the title about the backlash And little did I realize just exactly how much the backlash was going to be weighing on this field. But in any event, yes, the book really summarizes the ideas that led me to do the work. And also, I have 5 different case studies of specific projects that we've done in which we measured inclusion for different kinds of organizations that range from a startup to a multinational global Fortune 500 company. And it's something that I'm very proud of. And I really do hope that people will take advantage. Right now, the book actually, I've won multiple awards with the book, and my publisher has put it on sale on Amazon through the end of the summer of 2025 for 99 cents. And the goal there is not so much to make money, because when I sell a copy of the book for 99 cents, I might make 20 cents on it. But it's really more about getting people to spread the word. Instead of buying a cup of coffee, buy 5 copies and give it to your friends if you think it's a good book. But so I hope that people will really take the time to read the book and appreciate it. And I would love to get feedback on it.
Well, thank you for that. And everybody, you heard it right here. It is on sale until the end of this summer. So perfect opportunity to go ahead and check it out. We're going to have a link in the description box of this podcast. So be sure to go ahead and click on over. Perhaps wait till the end of our show before doing so, but it's right there and you can go ahead and check it out. So all of this being said, I did flip through the book a bunch myself. And interestingly enough, you do include 2 different backlash chapters in the book, talking about why DEI does have some criticism, and you discuss why they're right and why they're wrong. Well, first off, it's always amazing when authors include a balanced approach in their books, sort of the pros and the cons of their strategies. I'm wondering if you can shine a little bit of light on that. What is some of this criticism that you might be facing, and what made you decide ultimately to have that balance in the book?
Well, it's something that I realized early on when I got into the space, that especially as a white man in the space, I have to recognize that there's a tremendous amount of some things that I don't know, that I don't understand. I will never know what it's like to be a woman in the workplace or to be a person of color in the workplace. So I surround myself with people, and I spend a lot of time working with people, communicating with people who come from backgrounds that are different from mine. But I also happen to have an incredible privilege as being a white man that's educated with a book and a PhD and a former tenured professor. I can virtually get into any room with leaders who typically look like me, and they will see me as somebody that's part of their tribe, and so they will speak with me in a way that is much more candid, much more open, and conversely, when I speak to them, they're much more likely to listen to me. So one thing that I learned from early on is that I've always taken a very neutral stance. And part of what motivated my work was the recognition that in DEI, I felt that a lot of the emphasis, especially after the murder of George Floyd, has been on fairness and justice. And unfortunately, while that's a motivating factor for me and for a lot of my peers, ultimately, if you're running a company, that may be something that personally motivates you, but it's not part of your responsibility as a leader. And so my goal was always, first of all, let's take a neutral line where I understand the viewpoints of both sides and try to bring them together. But more importantly, I also, in doing my research, recognized that both sides have been making some very big mistakes. And so what I try to do is to say, look, we are sitting here having these arguments, and I would say right now, they have reached a fever pitch. We're talking about DEI as being an evil boogeyman that causes all kinds of problems. And then sort of the other side of the fence, people talk about meritocracy and how wonderful it is. Whereas if you ask people that are not white and male and cisgender and heterosexual, they will tell you that meritocracy often is just a decoy. It's just a way of essentially continuing to promote people who look like you. So how do we get these people to have such diametrically opposite views, even though ultimately we all want exactly the same thing? We want to be able to apply for a job that we're qualified for and have the same chance to get it as anybody else, regardless of what we look like. And if we do get that job, we want to be able to contribute to the company. We want to be able to get compensated. We want to be able to learn and advance and get promoted, regardless of what we look like. And that's exactly what both sides of that fence care about. So what I did in the book, and I'm actually expanding on that, and I've actually just signed a contract to write a second book. But in the book, I say, look, let's look at some of the mistakes that people in DI have made. And my goal is to hope that the people who work in DI will read that chapter and say, oh, oops. Okay, now I see why some of the language that I'm using and some of the things that I'm saying, or some of the things that I'm not saying, some of the metrics that I'm not developing are creating problems. But then I also go to the people that have been vocal against DI and say, listen, here's why when you say things like, oh, we're colorblind, we don't want to lower the bar, we only hire the best, you're actually making some flawed assumptions, some really dumb mistakes that are just going to hurt you and hurt people around you. And so I take out a bit of a big stick on both chapters and say, listen, we got to stop making these mistakes. And so I feel that that's incredibly important. And now it's even more important. And I'm working with a very dear friend of mine and now going to be co-author. We're writing another book that's going to be talking about what I would call inclusive meritocracy. How do you reconcile even more broadly, how do you take these ideas from my book right now and how do you expand the notions of meritocracy and diversity, equity, and inclusion to recognize what they share and build on that instead of continuing to argue and fight and create this polarization that frankly harms everyone. So my hope is that between my first book and my forthcoming second book, which will be out in April or May of 2026, I'm hoping that we will be able to start to bring back some of the rhetoric and really get back to the point where, hey, let's make sure that companies are doing the right thing for their talent. They're managing it properly so that the people are happy and so that they're making more money. Because ultimately, I think that's what we all want to do.
Well, I do appreciate you shining a little bit of light on that. And I understand how, just from a writer's standpoint, it must be very challenging to tackle all of these sections about criticism, which you just mentioned. I mean, it's very valid points. And I think it's really incredible that you're being self-aware and you're like, I know I need to address this. But it must have been challenging just as a writer. So I'm wondering if you had any internal processes for tackling these sections for the writers in the room. How do you write about these challenging topics?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And sort of there were two related answers. One of them is that I used to, until early this year, I was a regular contributor to Forbes from 2016 until early this year. And I wrote about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I got in the habit of usually, not always, if I was writing about something that I felt was a bit controversial or could be misunderstood, I would often share it with people in my circles and say, hey, what do you think? There have been a couple, at least 2 times that I can think of, when I drafted something, sent it to a couple of friends and they're like, no, you don't want to publish this. And I didn't, it was like, I try not to let my ego get in the way. And now, and especially, I mentioned that my next book is going to be with a co-author. So my co-author is Cynthia Overton, who's just amazing human being. She happens to be a Black woman. She happens to, have a lot of experience with DEI in many aspects of it. And I have the most amazing conversation with her. Like she and I, in fact, kind of want to start our own podcast and show how you can take people with very, very, very different life experiences that shape our perceptions and shape our viewpoints. And not just agree to disagree, because agreeing to disagree is kind of a cop-out. It's really about like, okay, I said this word and you didn't like it. Let me understand why you didn't like it. Let me explain to you why I did like it. Let me explain to you why I think for that audience it's better, and you help me understand how to change it for this audience. And so between the feedback from my writing and then also teaming up very, very purposefully with people like Cynthia. And Cynthia, by the way, I mean, other than the fact that she's just an amazing mind and she's really helped me to shape a lot of the thinking. And I feel like she and I have really grown together. But in particular, in terms of the writing, I love the fact that it's having somebody that can make sure that what I'm saying, because, this is one of the things about being a white person like me, right? There are things that I just don't see. That, privilege and privilege is, among white people, the word privilege, they get all kind of, don't talk about that. I mean, it's a fact, it's a reality. We all have different forms of privilege. But one of the things is that you don't see it, and it's okay that you don't see it. There's nothing, it's not bad, it doesn't make you an evil person. But if you are going to be addressing issues that are somehow impacted by your privilege, then you have to make an effort to try to figure that out. You have to make an effort to get other people's viewpoints, and that's what I try to do. And I think that for writing, I mean, look, ultimately I could write a book that only a few people would read because, a lot of other people are going to be pissed off. And that's something that it wouldn't be very good for me, and it wouldn't help me to get more people to understand the things that I'm writing about. So it's not just about, let's make sure that I'm writing well. It's to make sure that I actually have the impact that I want to have.
Well, hey, I appreciate you giving us that advice. I think that's useful knowledge, not just for, any authors or, people looking to write their own books involving strategies. I think they could follow your example there. But also in general, I think it's great for everyone to acknowledge and know that there are some struggles in relaying this information, but ultimately it has to be done. So I appreciate that. So all this being said then, I guess I'm curious about your writing routine. I mean, you're balancing running companies, speaking, and research. How did you find the time to write a book like this?
It's funny because when before I wrote the book, I had spoken to people that have written books, and they all said, your first book, you have no idea what you're getting into. And I'm very fortunate that I've always been able to write fairly easily, fairly quickly, and reasonably well. I think that I've made efforts to improve my writing, and I'm always looking for constructive feedback. But when I decided to do the book, I thought, listen, I write Forbes articles all the time. I've been writing all over the place. I write all the time, whether it's proposals, whether it's white papers, whether it's reports, and I love writing. So to me, I thought, okay, how big of a deal is that going to be? What I found was that a couple of things, one of them is that, of course, I underestimated how much time it would take me to do the first full draft. And partly was because I thought I've already written a bunch of pieces, so I just have to glue them together. And then what I realized is that it's like, oh, I wrote this 6 months ago, but now my perspective has changed slightly and it doesn't really fit in with this other one. So in the end, I ended up basically rewriting the entire book from scratch. And what I ended up doing is, when it was about 2 weeks from the deadline, I called a friend of mine, a very dear friend in Italy, who happens to have this beautiful little mountain house up on a mountain in the Dolomites. And I go back and forth to Italy all the time because of, my family. My father's still there. And so I called him up and I said, hey, listen, can I come hide out there for a week and just write? And so I ended up doing that. I'm hoping that with the second book, especially having a co-author, will be a lot more systematic. But I do have to say that one profound difference between writing a book and just writing articles and ideas and things like that, or reports, is that the writing of the book is really a fraction of the work that you have to do to get the book out. You have to go through multiple rounds of editing, but also it's the promotion, it's the cover design, it's, what word are you going to put, how are you going to describe your own book on online websites, what words are you going to put on the back cover, what's the subtitle going to be? I mean, any of those things. And then of course the planning of the launch. So my realization is that probably my writing skills and my writing habits, at least for somebody who's only an occasional writer, are really not as significant as just being prepared to understand all of the pieces that go into writing of a book. If I was somebody like Isabel Allende, who writes one book every year, I don't know how they actually does it, right? These people that do these amazing writings that are writing all the time, I'm not doing that, so it's a little bit different. And so for me, now that I'm writing this new book, again, we have a schedule, we have deadlines. So I'm a little bit better about saying, okay, we need to write this chapter by this date and write that chapter by that date. In the end, I still tend to be the kind of writer that probably most editors would hate, because I tend to just let it sit there, and then I'll just take like a 5-hour chunk and just boom, just kind of like dump out a bunch of text. So I would not necessarily advise anyone to do it the way that I do it. And I would not consider myself a pro in terms of, hey, I've done this 20 times and I can tell you a really, really good routine to do it.
Understood. Well, hey, it's great that you did find a system that worked for you, and that you did take advice of others, and figuring out exactly how long it should be taking, and so on and so forth. So all this being said, you have a great system out there, you have the book out there, it's on sale now. I'm wondering, what's next for you? What's next on the on your journey here? Any other books that might be coming out, or new plans for promoting the system? What's on the agenda?
Several things. I mean, I mentioned already the fact that I'm going to be working on this book about meritocracy and about, the intersection of inclusion and meritocracy. There is another book that I've been wanting to write for years. This one I've been wanting to write for a much longer time. And it really talks about the methodology that led me to do all of my work, including this work on measuring inclusion. And it's about understanding the connection between the individual and the collective. I've actually written a book proposal. I've been sitting on it. It's one of the things where I just haven't had the time. Part of the reason is because, as you, I'm sure, are aware, right now the field of diversity, equity, and inclusion is on fire, not in a good way, not in a good sense of that expression. And with the current administration here in the US literally trying to make DEI illegal in every facet of society, it has been a very hard hit for many of my colleagues, myself included. And in fact, one of the things that's been a blessing is that, having written the book, I had the fortune of I've done 2 TEDx talks, and one of them was actually picked up by the TED organization and is now featured as a main TED talk on the website. That happened last year. So that's given me visibility, and I'm getting a lot of speaking invitations, which is kind of helping me to keep things afloat. But my focus right now is rebuilding the business by leveraging the unique value of what I bring to the table, and in particular the fact that it's able to reconcile different viewpoints and sort of remove some of the backlash and some of the risk that companies face, and trying to use that as a way to kind of rebuild the business back up because it's been a pretty hard hit since the beginning of the year, and really spread the word more. So I'm out there. I'm constantly sending out free copies of my book to people that I know, saying, hey, can you please help me to spread the word? I organize events. I have a big conference coming up at the end of October on diversity and inclusion research, although we don't even call it that anymore because, you'd be amazed. So juggling a million balls. I also, as I mentioned, I have a nonprofit, so I've been doing some research on that side that's looking more at frontline workers and low-level workers that are not compensated properly, and building computer simulations to show companies that they can actually make more money by treating their employees better, not just in terms of diversity and inclusion, but also in terms of people like frontline workers, which of course tend to be primarily or very heavily non-white, non-male people. So yeah, doing a million things, a lot of speaking, a lot of traveling. Just came back from Italy and Sweden. I'm going to be speaking in Germany. I've spoken in England twice this year. I may go to Colombia. I was invited to speak in Colombia last year, and they invited me to do another thing again this year if I can do it. So it's juggling a lot of balls and trying to keep my head above the water, but I have to say, still just loving every minute of it. And in spite of the challenges, to me, represent a huge opportunity because people need these kinds of methodologies. They need something that gets rid of the backlash and gets rid of the hatred and the anger and starts making forward progress. And that's what I'm hoping that I can contribute to.
Well, wow, you definitely have a full plate, but it's important to know that you're continuing the good work of all this, right? You're still, finding more opportunities, traveling around, really spreading the word as much as you can. So that's really valuable. So if anybody was interested in following along with your journey, staying up to date, getting the latest news updates, where is the best place for them to connect with you and to get in touch?
Well, I would say one of two things. If you go to my website, which is aleria.tech, so that's spelled aleria.tech, and you'll find my profile, you'll find contact information. Also LinkedIn. My name, Paolo Gaudiano, is not that common, and so you can find me on LinkedIn quite easily. If anybody wants to reach out and communicate, feel free to send me a connection request. My only ask would be, if you do, just include a little note about why you're reaching out to me, because I often get requests from people that I don't know. So you might say, hey, I heard you on Danielle's show and, Authors on Missions, and, want to talk to you, whatever. More than happy to connect with people. And other than that, you can find me also if you go to the TED website, search for my name, you will see both of my TED Talks are featured on the website. And I hope you'll, some of you may want to come. I hold this conference in late October, DIRC, D-I-R-C. It's at dirk.info. So any of those methods, and again, I have a sufficiently unique name that if you even search for me on Google, you'll find me pretty easily.
All right. Well, thank you for that. So everyone, we're going to put the links in the description box of this podcast today, including a link to the book, which is on sale on Amazon. So be sure to check all of that out. And now, Paolo, I'm wondering, do you happen to have any last bits of advice for our audience today as we begin to wrap up? I mean, anybody feeling inspired, but maybe feeling overwhelmed with where to start? What's one thing you'd want them to remember from our conversation today?
I would like people to remember that, unfortunately, a lot of the troubles that we're seeing related to diversity, equity, and inclusion are fueled by political motivation. Unfortunately, for politicians and also for the media, controversy is significantly more powerful than agreement. And so their tendency to fuel this hatred and this polarization, and what I really tell people is, take a deep breath, step back, and really recognize that when you hear negative stories about the other side, whichever side you happen to be on, there is a very good chance that those stories are either partly fabricated or wildly exaggerated. And realize that ultimately we're all human beings and we all want the same things. We want to be able to have a roof over our heads and have, be able to put a hot meal or any kind of a meal in front of us and be able to have safety. And so my recommendation would be, don't panic. Don't let yourself get caught up in the anger of online social media and bashing people and things of that sort. And really think about the fact that we're all human beings and we all basically want the same things, and that we can benefit significantly more by working together and getting along with each other and trying to understand each other than trying to create this kind of hatred and division, which I think really, really unfortunate.
Understood. Well, thank you so much for that last bit of advice. I think it's really important for us all to take into consideration as well. And Paula, I think what you've given us today is some amazing tips and incredible methodology to really show us, the future of work. And I think it's great that it's all data driven. There's examples in there, and you've also given us some wonderful insights as authors as well. So all in all, I think this has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Danielle. Really, really appreciate it.
Of course. And to all the listeners out there, if you're ready to stop guessing about inclusion, start measuring it. Measuring Inclusion is your guide. Be sure to check it out. It's written by this amazing author here with a mission to change the world through his expertise. And right back at you, everybody. Remember that you too could be the blueprint to someone else's needs to build their success. So don't forget to write your own book. Until next time, keep building, keep measuring, keep making your mission matter. This has been another episode of Authors on Mission podcast. We'll see you next time, everyone.
Thank you.
This is Danielle Hutchinson reminding you that somewhere, someone needs the book that only you can write. Visit authorsonmission.com to start your legacy. Until next time, keep leading, keep inspiring, and keep thinking in chapters. Have a great day.